welcome to the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Kathleen Tobin, Associate Professor of History at Purdue University, Calumet. Kathleen has been studying birth control policy for over 20 years, and she's the author of the book, Politics and Population Control. Kathleen, welcome to the Roundtable.
Thank you.
You use the term in your book, population issues. What does that involve?
Well, it involves a number of things. Sometimes it is control because the powers that be, either internationally or at a nationwide level, want to control population movement or birth rates in some form or another. But it includes issues of the environment and resources. It includes sometimes eugenics or the sterilization of who were termed the unfit, during the 20th century. It includes issues of race, because sometimes people are concerned about certain types of people having too many babies. Usually people aren't concerned about people like themselves having a lot of children, but they do look at the issue economically and so on.
What's the biggest influence over this? Is it economics, or is it racial prejudice? Is it, what drives this more than anything else?
Well, those of us in history tend to agree that economics drives just about everything. So I guess it depends on who you talk to. Of course, I would say early in the 20th century, people who spoke about birth rates in racial terms did not hold back in some of their statements because racism was so prevalent.
Right.
If you talk about birth control in racial terms today, people are, less inclined to say it's because of race. So there are ways to sort of dig a little bit deeper to see what some of the real motivations are.
And the economic side of it?
Well, in the 19th century, for what is now the developed world or the industrialized world, population growth was considered tied to economic growth. So in places like the United States and other countries in the Americas where there was still a good deal of land and resources, and they wanted to develop technologically or industrially, population growth was seen as a good thing. For example, after the Civil War, when there was a population decline because of war casualties in the United States, we were also in the United States trying to build the railroads and factories and so on. And so we enticed immigration and encouraged birth rates.
So how did we encourage birth rates? What form did that take?
Well, they abolished contraceptives.
So you're saying that the use of contraceptives was abolished not for any other reason except to encourage population growth?
That was part of it. There are some discussions at the time and by historians afterward that see the tie to economic development. At the time, contraceptives and contraceptive information were made illegal, and that was in the 1870s. Yeah. It was presented more as a moral issue.
Right.
So this was the Victorian era, and they were Victorian moralists, who were not Catholic, by the way. They were, religious from other denominations. They sort of presented the issue as one of morality of women, and they wanted women to exhibit, high moral standards, and if they didn't have that consequence of pregnancy, they were afraid that, women would sort of engage in sexual activity in a different way. And there were concerns at the time about good proper stock, which was white Anglo-Saxon Protestant stock in the United States, as being sort of diminished by immigrants and other people.
And this gets into the eugenics
issue, so
right?
It's all tied together. It's hard to separate it sometimes.
And then you had movements that were working against this, obviously, the movement to give women the right to vote, the suffragette movement, right?
Right, so that was tied to the legalization of contraceptives as well, and Linda Gordon, who's an historian in birth control, she ties it quite closely to politics. When women were fighting for the right to vote and getting close to achieving such a thing, some people in the political sphere wanted to clamp down even further on contraceptive use. So women were trying to fight for legalized contraception. As sort of a women's issue, having control and freedom and choice. This was in the 19-teens. And at the same time, they're coming close to getting the right to vote. So it is kind of tied together there.
And to take that a step further, if women have no control over whether or not they're going to be bearing children, obviously that limits what they can do as citizens, as
right.
In terms of their careers, things like that, right?
Right. In industrialized society, it seems that there are factors that naturally encourage decline in the birth rate. When women have better access to education and there are different kinds of economic opportunities, and also when they outlaw child labor, children are no longer economically valuable. Right. So on the farms, the more children you had, the better, because they could do work there. Right. In a factory society, where children couldn't work, then they were considered more of an economic cost than a benefit.
Vouch for that.
And that happens in the United States. By the 1920s, they're looking at how much it costs to have a child, because more and more are expected to, it's tied to a standard of living and potential college and things like that.
So as early as the 1920s, somebody's trying to figure out what it costs to raise a child, and that's impacting the decision about birth control. Well,
yeah, I originally looked at it as an economic issue. I started this, it actually started as a paper for a class.
This goes back to when you were in graduate school at University of Chicago.
Right,
yeah.
Right. I was taking a course with Martin Marty, who's like a supreme expert in religious history, particularly in the United States. And this was a class on religion during the Depression. And so I was already a mother myself. That's another story, trying to get a PhD when you have young children. But so I suppose it was on my mind. And I wanted to know what the Catholic Church said about contraception during the Depression. Because in the United States, we do see it as a personal, family, economic decision sometimes. Right. And that's when I started to uncover a whole lot about population policy.
Okay, and so we've talked a little bit about the historical context of all of this. What was it that was important about the mid-19th century? I think you said in your book that was a key point here. Why specifically that?
Well, there were a number of things happening in the United States. First of all, women, and I should say couples, because it takes male and female to make this an issue. Couples were using all kinds of things for thousands of years as barriers. It wasn't as if they never tried to prevent pregnancy before. But what happens in the mid-19th century is a vulcanization of rubber process that makes different kinds of sort of modern contraceptives available and accessible, and people were using them in greater numbers. Also, there's a rise of a medical profession and a certification of doctors, and it becomes more of a male-dominated profession in the mid to late 19th century. And women who had exchanged information in the past and helped deliver babies and even spread information about what could cause an abortion, because women were sharing information amongst themselves. All of this was kind of coming to the surface. So when women were making strides in other areas, there are powers that be, some of them dominated by religion, who wanted to keep women, especially proper women, sort of under control.
So it sounds like all of the issues that we associate with birth control today really were emerging then 150 years ago.
Yes. In research and technology, religious issues, political issues, gender issues, I think it makes the topic today and the way it's unfolding in the news with the Affordable Care Act and so on, sort of reminiscent of what's been going on for a long time.
Well, I'm just guessing here, what was the availability of the pill in the 1960s, the next big turning point for this debate?
Yeah, that's one of the areas I'm looking at now, because it does change things. And the way it changes things is it gives more control to women. There's no sort of interference in relations with the birth control pill. And interestingly, the Catholic Church, who had become known as sort of the enemy of birth control, even though they weren't the only church that opposed birth control at this time, in the 1960s, there was a good possibility that they were going to approve it because of the pill, because
Really?
The pill was different. Yes, it didn't act as an artificial barrier. That was the term that they used. The artificial barrier was wrong, and nothing should stand in the way of procreation of life. But with the pill, it prevents ovulation, so nothing is standing in the way of that relationship as far as procreating or creating another life. So there was a great investigation. It was the time of the Second Vatican Council, when the church was studying a lot of things, and there's a shift in the church from Pope John to Pope Paul, and Pope Paul took the issue of birth control separately. He didn't want the Second Vatican Council to address it. He wanted to address it separately, and it looked as if the church was going to move forward, and this was going to be the opening of the door. And then in 1968, he announces no.
And there were a lot of, that's referred to as Vatican II.
Yeah.
Am I right? And there were a lot of changes that resulted from that. The English in the liturgies in America instead of Latin and things like that. So you're saying that one of the pieces of Vatican II was almost the acceptance of birth control.
Yes.
That's kind of an earth-shaking revelation.
So I watch our new Pope. Well, I guess he's not that new anymore. So I'm watching this issue a little bit carefully. He hasn't made a pronouncement, but I anticipate he will speak about birth control in the next couple of years.
Do you think there's a possibility that the Catholic Church would take a different position on this?
I personally do. They may create more of a dividing line. When contraceptives were made available, or there was a push by the 1920s, they separated abortion from contraception very clearly. In fact, the people who were promoting contraceptives argued that it would help prevent abortions. That's another really important issue, is there are a good number of people in the United States who believe if we make abortion illegal, there will be no abortion. And that is not the case. Yeah. There were, they estimate about 1 million abortions a year in the 1920s, and so they were dangerous and so on. So what I think happened was through the 1970s, the two became tied together. I think if anything, the church might separate the two out and say no to abortion, but maybe yes to contraception.
Yeah, I wouldn't know which direction they're going to go in, but I think there's some obvious logic to making them separate issues.
And theologians are very logical. They will study this, and it's interesting about studying birth control history is I can go to Notre Dame or other Catholic universities, and there are many, many materials to look at because they talked about birth control a lot.
Yeah, for a long time apparently. Okay, we're going to take a quick commercial break, and I'll be back at the Calumet Roundtable with our guest, Dr. Kathleen Tobin. Thank you. Welcome back to the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach. My guest today is Dr. Kathleen Tobin, Associate Professor of History at Purdue University, Calumet. Kathleen's been studying birth control for over 20 years, going back to your doctoral dissertation at University of Chicago, I understand. And she's giving us some very interesting insights on the history of this controversial topic. One of the things I wanted to ask you about today is the term population explosion. I read an article years ago about this, and the author claimed that that population explosion is a rhetorical device, essentially. And he argued that, and it's been a long time, but he argued essentially that if you divided all of the inhabitable land in the world up evenly, everybody would get 5 acres or something like that. And that really, we don't have a population explosion policy, we've got a land distribution policy. It was probably some Marxist, I don't know. But I'm just wondering what your take on the population explosion argument is.
There are legitimate arguments on both sides, but I think the term population bomb and population explosion really emerged in the 1960s. That term was used, it is rhetorical in that, it's the atomic era, and that would get anybody's attention.
Right.
And as a growth in population was deemed a benefit in economic growth for the United States and Europe in the 19th century.
Sure.
Once populations started to grow rapidly in the 20th century in Latin America and Africa and Asia, the industrialized world had a different take on it. So they started to argue that high birth rates would contribute to poverty rather than grow their economies.
Now, was that just another rhetorical argument, or was there justification for that?
Again, it depends on who you talk to, and this is an area that I'm looking at more closely now, the 1960s. I'm fascinated by it. I tend to believe that they weren't recognizing the differences in their attitudes. But demographers had some decent arguments about the ways in which economies were developing, and that they weren't developing in ways where rapid population growth and high birth rates could sustain economic growth. At the same time, the industrialized world needed resources in Latin America and Africa, and that's true even today.
Well, yeah, and isn't that one of the things that's complicating the debate today? I think more so for the Republicans and the Democrats about immigration.
Yeah.
Because there's a group that says, we want open immigration simply because they want the workers, right?
Right, and there are some recent sociological studies that really look at how much immigrants contribute to the economy of the United States. That those jobs would not be filled by native workers, and that they do pay taxes and so on. So
how do we have a population problem then if we're encouraging people to come over the borders?
It is growing very rapidly, so I think it's worth looking at. I don't think we should ignore it. If you look at the census.gov website, for example, it's got a rolling number, so you can see how many.
You can see it moving.
That's scary. It is growing fast, and in my lifetime, it's doubled and tripled, and so it's growing fast. At the same time, you have to be very careful, and historians do this. We consider the source. So who's saying that and why? If the National Security Council is saying their population density around the Middle East is too high, it's probably because they want to get at the petroleum resources, and this goes back to the 1970s. And that's true of copper deposits and petroleum deposits in South America as well.
Really?
So you just have to be vigilant.
How does that impact our access to copper deposits?
Well, what they were arguing, and this is an article, or actually a book chapter that I'm working on right now. There's a book being put together by an author who's publishing through Vanderbilt University Press. And the book is on on sex, gender, and the Cold War. He already wrote one on race in the Cold War and religion in the Cold War. So this is on sex, gender, and the Cold War. And
he's staying away from the controversial topics, obviously.
And so I'm looking at how the U.S. was concerned about birth rates during the Cold War, international birth rates. So first with the Soviet Union, and then with China, and then Latin America and the Middle East. That's sort of in the later part of the Cold War.
So in other words, the U.S.'s involvement with birth rates in other countries.
Well, other authors have sort of uncovered how population organizations have distributed contraceptives and tried to control population. I'm just looking at the concerns right now, and I'm seeing that they're economic concerns. The Soviet population was, not that great. Their populations were really hurt by the 2 world wars.
And by Stalin executing.
Exactly.
Everybody disagreed with him.
And they had so much territory. But the United States was concerned about women going to work and, this driving force in the economy, and that the communist economic system might compete with the capitalist economic system. So I'm looking at that. But in the later part of the Cold War, the industrialized world needs metals, copper and so on, to stay industrialized. And when there are high rates of population and birth rates, there is some concern. What they were also arguing...
The concern being what?
Well, that they can't get at them, first of all.
But the populations would destabilize the government?
Right.
Or
so when they're arguing in the 1970s that population does not contribute to economic growth in these areas, it causes poverty and economic and political instability.
Right.
This is the Cold War, so they're afraid that these populations will turn to more radical politics. And they look at demographics, they look at what ages they are.
So do we get involved in this at this period? Do we send crates of
yes.
products down there?
I have not tied the two together.
No.
I had intended to tie the two together, but I let other historians do that. So
I'm picturing those drops we do when there's famines. We drop food, only now we're dropping contraceptives. Maybe is that?
Yes, they may not fall from the sky, but they are distributed. And another issue that's worth looking at is that contraceptives and birth control methods are experimented with in the developing world. So IUDs that were considered not safe, intrauterine devices that were considered not safe in the United States, they would dump them in Africa. When they tested the birth control pill, it had very high rates of hormones that made women very sick, and so they tested them in Mexico and Puerto Rico. So by the 1970s, they compounded birth control pill experiments in Puerto Rico with sterilization. So by about the 1970s, about a third of women in Puerto Rico were sterilized. And that was to help. The argument was that they would be able to work because they were working in factories. Then, manufacturing and clothing and so on. It would allow women to work if they weren't having babies.
Yeah.
But there's a fine line between voluntary sterilization and involuntary sterilization.
Well, yeah. I don't think it's a very fine line at all, actually. I think it's a big, thick line, but I get what you're saying. There's so many things here that I'd like to pursue. If anyone thought they knew the debate over contraceptives, I think after listening to you for a few minutes, they'd realize that there's so much more to this.
It's very complex.
Than we've considered. Just a couple background issues here as we close. What text do you study to draw the conclusions that you've drawn? You look at speeches? Do you look at laws that are written? What?
It depends on what area I'm looking at with the issue. And again, historians are taught to be very careful about who is the speaker, who is the audience. So a speech would have one intention and one result. So I would end up going into religious proceedings. Some of them were more difficult than others to get to, but say the Southern, Baptist Council and the Catholic Church, you know, what the Pope says, papal encyclicals are the final word, but theologians would be debating all the time. I look at legislation and Supreme Court decisions.
Right.
It's important to look at the wording. Sometimes I look at CIA documents.
Right. Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, so this is, I mean, you're clearly studying the public sphere when you study this. In other words, you're studying everything that you can get your hands on, right? That's communicated this issue.
It makes it more broad and more complex, so you know you really have to focus.
Right, right. I can imagine that you could have your book on the topic, and then you could have another 5 volumes of all of the text that you were indexing.
When I was writing my dissertation on religion and birth control, people made assumptions like, you know, well, you know, Planned Parenthood would be interested in that, but in that I critique Planned Parenthood as well. You know, we know this is a Catholic, you know, the Catholic Church against women issue, and that's not what I uncovered either. So it's very complicated. Yeah, it's
certainly not as cut and dry as we thought it was, and I was fascinated to learn earlier that the Catholic Church was actually considering taking the opposite position on it.
Yeah.
So what are you researching recently other than this, or maybe some other aspect of this? Tell me.
Lately I've had, well, I did publish an article on security. It's in a book on security issues in Southeast Asia, and I looked at population issues in Vietnam. I wanted to kind of get out of the United States and Latin America and sort of apply what I had come to know to an area that I was unfamiliar with. And that turned out to be interesting. And then I did...
So tell me a little about that. What did you look at?
Well,
Vietnam especially.
It begins, historians keep going back. So it begins with French colonialism and how the French tried to manipulate populations by creating villages in certain places.
Oh, did they really?
And yeah, it helps them control things.
Well, this sounds like it's going to be a much longer topic than we can go into right now, but that sounds like another good one for us to talk about. We've all become more familiar with Southeast Asia because of the involvement we've had over there over the years.
Oh, yeah.
Which I'm sure is one of the things that attracted you to it.
Oh, yeah.
Well, this has been very informative, and I think we've taken the issue a lot deeper than any of the other discussions I've seen on television. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank
my
you.
guest, once again, was Dr. Kathleen Tobin, Associate Professor of History at Purdue University, Calumet. I'm Tom Roach, and thank you for watching the Calumet Roundtable.